Libero. According to the latest edition of the Global Terrorism Index, published in March 2022 by the Institute for Economic and Peace, Chile is ranked 18th among the countries with the highest amount of terrorism out of 163 countries. In the last 2 years, the country dropped 29 spots in the ranking, from number 47 to number 18. Now, Chile is the second country in Latin America with the highest percentage of terrorism after Colombia, which is in the position number 14. Mr. Steve Gilale, global philanthropist focused on peace and sustainable development, technology entrepreneur, and founder and president of the Institute for Economic and Peace, an international think tank that aims to create a paradigm shift in the way the world thinks about peace, is here with us. Thank you, Mr. Gilale, for joining us today, and welcome to Mirada Libero. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks. Well, it's very good to be here.
Thank you. So, okay. Well, as we mentioned in the beginning, the Institute for Economic and Peace has just published its edition number 9 of the Global Terrorism Index. Let's start a little bit about general concept by defining terrorism. Mr. Gilale, how do you define terrorism for the purpose of the index? And what are the main criteria? What elements typify a terrorist attack?
So if we look at the definition of a terrorism, it's an act of violence or a threat of violence by a non-state actor, that means a non-government organisation, with the aim of sending a message to an audience broader than those people which are impacted by the violence. Now, there are many different types of terrorist attacks, and they range from things like, let's say, kidnapping, when it can be aimed at sending a message to a broader community than those just kidnapped or their families. It can involve bombs or incendiary devices. It could involve guns. It could involve the burning of buildings, which we have seen happen in Chile, for example. So sometimes it's aimed at inflicting maximum harm on civilians, but at other times it can be simply sending a message that we're here and want to be negotiated with.
Thank you, Mr. Gilale. So can you explain me a little bit like the types of terrorism in terms of there is like religious terrorism, ethno-national terrorism, political terrorism? Maybe you can give me a brief explanation of each of these and why these differences are important.
Sure, there's different motivations for terrorism. So, for example, like Islamic terrorism is one which has been right through the press over the last decade or 15 years. And that's sort of religiously motivated terrorism where they're trying to bring about a caliphate or religious government in the areas where they're working. Then you've got political terrorism. That can be far left, that can be far right, and it can be by organised groups, or it can be by individuals which are aligned with a particular type of philosophy, for example. So there'd be some of the different types. So generally, we look at it along religious lines, political lines, or other. That'd be the better way of putting it. Then when we're looking at political lines, it can be far left, far right, and whether they're associated with a group or not associated with a group.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn a little bit into the Chilean case. As we mentioned in the beginning, Chile got to the position number 18 among the countries with the highest level of terrorism out of 163 countries of the ranking. Moreover, it dropped 29 positions in 2 years. Within the region, Chile follows Colombia, which occupies position 14. Mr. Gilale, what is happening in Chile? Why did the country drop so many spots in the ranking in such a short period of time? What would you say?
So the first thing I might just comment on Latin America in general. It's actually got the regions of the world the lowest rates of terrorism globally. Colombia, it's all associated with the drug cartels. But if we come down and we look at Chile, what we find is that it's been a progressive increase every year since 2013. So in 2013. So in 2013, there were only 3 terrorist incidents recorded. And now each year it's increased since then. So in 2021, there were 362 terrorist incidences. But what I'd say is there's very, very few deaths. So in 2021, there was 1 death. And if we went back to 2020, there were 6 deaths. So it's really the number of incidences. Now, all these incidences are related with the indigenous group called the Machi. And so which are obviously, as you know well, trying to seek to get their tribal lands back and sort of looking for more independence from the Chilean government.
Thank you. So in Chile, there is a discussion in the public debate around whether the violence occurring in the south of the country, in the southern macro zone, can be considered terrorism or not. Taking into consideration the report, would you affirm that there is terrorism in Chile, and why? How does terrorism in Chile looks like, and how can you describe it?
Yeah, well, I think these things get quite complicated. So that for one person's freedom fighter, quite often it's another person's terrorist. Like Nelson Mandela, for example, in South Africa, went to jail for terrorism. So we don't get caught up in the debate around what's justified or unjustified. We just simply count the numbers. But certainly, since they're interested in trying to be able to get more autonomy and to be able to get more land, the acts they're taking, let's say like the burning of the houses, is sent as a message which is sent to a broader population that we want to get some form of recognition and some compensation in some way or form. So I think on that basis, that's why to be seen as an act of terrorism.
Okay. Yes, because violence and terrorism. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Additionally, when we look at it, 70% of the attacks do involve weapons.
Okay. 70% of the attacks involved attacks to women. Okay. Yes. Well, violence have become a reality since 1998 for a large part of the inhabitants who live in the south of Chile, in the Chilean southern macro zone. More than 40 people have been killed between 2012 and 2021. Armed gangs have stolen timber, extorted people, invaded agricultural lands, and burned houses. Can these types of acts be considered as terrorist attacks?
Yes, well, that's the way they're being counted within the Global Terrorism Index. Now, if they're performed by a criminal organisation, simply for a personal gain, that wouldn't be included as a terrorist act, but it's done by an organisation or people who might be loosely affiliated with an organisation, and it's about sort of trying to change the political dynamics in the country, then that's different.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Kilele, a new president is taking office in Chile. What do you think are the main challenges that a new government might face in the fight against terrorism?
Yeah, well, I think quite often these things get complicated, but a lot of the time one needs to look at the underlying drivers of the terrorism. They can come down to a whole range of the different issues. So obviously group grievances, which you can see is going on here, is one of the key drivers. Corruption quite often can come into it too, but I won't comment on corruption in Chile because I don't understand the situation well enough. But corruption quite often can be seen in it as well. So to some extent, there's a need to be able to address a legitimate concerns where there are gross inequalities and such. But they can be done in many different ways. It can be through broadening education, inclusion in education programs and such. Can sometimes be done with land reforms. But what I would say is the government does need to take a strong stance against the terrorism. Otherwise, if you don't, it just encourages more. So you do need a strong rule of law in trying to control it. But on the other hand, one has to be careful that the actual act of trying to root out the terrorists and arrest them, particularly, it doesn't lead to further alienation of the group which they may be part of. So without understanding the Chilean situation in detail, I make those general comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Kilele, do you know other cases in which a country has dropped so many spots in the ranking in such a short period of time? Like,
look, if you have to, the construction of the index is it's got a sliding scale. So so you've got to understand there are a lot of countries where have no terrorism, okay? And so there are certainly countries which have far worse hit and have been hit much, much harder. So we went to the Sahel, for example, which is in the northern end of sub-Saharan Africa. That's probably the epicenter of global terrorism at the moment. And the number of deaths through terrorism since 2007 are up 10 times, okay? 43% of all deaths globally come from there, and that's over 2,000. That's about 2,200 deaths in 2021. And we can see some countries there, like Niger, for example, where the lethality rate of each attack is 23 people dying in each attack. So to put it in perspective, although there's been 362 attacks in Chile, only one of them resulted in a death. And so it's the number of attacks which is really pulling the country down on the rankings more so than the number of deaths. So the way we develop the index, we've got four things we take into account. The first is incidences, the second is death, the third is injuries, and the fourth is hostage taking.
thank you, Mr. Kilele. Now going to, turning to at a global level, does terrorism in Chile have any similarities with other countries elsewhere, with terrorism having place in other countries elsewhere in the world? Like,
one area which is similar is the Northern Ireland, funnily enough. So what's happening in Chile, a lot of them are incendiary devices. So they're sort of, and again, so a lot of it's sending a message and attacks on government infrastructure and things like that in terms of destroying them. So what we find in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of incendiary devices get set off there. That's by the new IRA, and a lot of it is when they just put an incendiary device in a garbage can outside a government building or a police station or things like that. That's more, from their part, more of a negotiating tactic. And so what we can see here, the aim is not really about killing people, because if they were with 362 attacks, if they're intent on killing people, there'd be a lot more deaths. So, for example, globally, there were 5,200 deaths through terrorism and about 7,300 attacks. There were 7,100 deaths and about a bit over 5,000 attacks. And so the average there's about 1.4 deaths per attack. So if these attacks represented the global average, you'd have something like maybe 500 to 600 people killed. So the aim is not to kill. The aim is to do property destruction or send messages that we're here and we want to be heard and negotiated with.
thank you. Turning a little bit to the COVID-19 pandemic, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted terrorism in the world and in the West specifically?
Yeah, in the West, specifically, it's quite interesting. So when we look at the West, that's the generally sort of the European countries and a string of others like Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So now what's happened there is the deaths from terrorism fallen dramatically over the last 3 years. In fact, they're down 75%. And if we look at acts of political terrorism, they're now over the last 5 years, are 5 times higher in number than religious terrorism, which was basically nearly all Islamic. Now, the drop's quite remarkable. We've also seen far-right terrorism subside and seen far-left terrorism increase. So now it's a very, very pleasing trend, and I think it's very good to take at face value. But one wonders what the impact of COVID may have been on it. And so there's a few things which we find with COVID. So in the 2 years of COVID, really the last 3 years now, if we look at it, we find the number of the restrictions on public movement have been strong. You don't get the same gatherings for people in large places, which mean it's harder to find targets for terrorists. Also, we think that sort of with COVID, a lot of people's angst is turned inside. So a lot of people are worried about their own personal health. So their mental disposition's going there rather than thinking about perceived injustices and things like that, which they then launch attacks on. So we think that comes into play as well. And there's been a shift with people's anger, maybe away from other types of injustices towards restrictions with lockdowns and vaccinations and other such things like that. But at this stage, that's hypothesis. We don't fully know.
And to coming to an end, at the Institute of Economic and Peace, you produce other indexes, such as the Positive Peace Index report. How would you define peace, and which are the elements that make possible a peaceful society?
Well, that's an excellent question. So we work with, peace in many ways, there's many different definitions, and it depends what you're trying to achieve. So we work with 2 definitions. The first one's the Global Peace Index, which is the world's leading measure of global peacefulness. That's the absence of violence or fear of violence. And that's excellent for understanding how peaceful a country is, whether it's becoming more peaceful, net or less peaceful, and what dimensions that's occurring on. But it doesn't tell you what creates peace. So to find that, we produced the Positive Peace Index, which definitions the attitude, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. And we derived that through mathematical modelling and statistics. So it's not the idea of any of the researchers, it's really empirically derived. We find there's qualities, 8 different qualities which come to, or pillars, if you like, which come together to create peace. And they operate in a systemic fashion. And none of them are counterintuitive, but you've got to be really focusing on all of them. So there are things like well-functioning government, low levels of corruption, strong business environment, equitable distribution of resources, acceptance of other people's rights, high levels of human capitals, good relationships with your neighbours, and free flow of information. Now, no one would argue that they're unpopular things. And generally, if we look at positive peace globally, it is improving, has been improving over time. But they're the qualities which build resilience. And when you've got the resilience within a society, then they don't slip into a conflict. It's very hard to upset the peace. But more importantly, when we look at positive peace, it's also related to a whole range of other things we think are important, like higher per capita income, better performance on measures of the ecology, better performance on measures of well-being and happiness, better performance in measures of development, and also in terms of the inclusion. So in many ways, we'd say positive peace describes an optimal environment in which human potential can flourish.
Thank you. And one last question. What would you say are the main challenges for the world peace today?
Well, The main challenges for the world today is that I think there's a number. Obviously, the Ukraine is dominating at the moment. But what we can see from the Ukraine is the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you've got a population which doesn't want to be invaded, and they've got access to sophisticated weapons, even the best militaries in the world can't win. Okay, so in many ways, Russia, even with all its might, is not going to be able to successfully hold the Ukraine if they keep fighting. So I think sort of that's one of the messages and lessons we can see at the moment. And in many ways, that's a good lesson. That's something which pushes us all towards peace. I think one of the other areas of concern is, in many ways, there's an erosion of if you like, the attitudes which support peace globally. You can see that through positive peace. Even though positive peace overall is going up, it consists of 3 different domains, and one of them is attitudes. And so we can see perceptions of corruption arising globally. We can see democracy is somewhat on the decline. You can also see that a lot of the inequalities in many countries are increasing as well, as is group grievances. And so globally, we need to start to look and address these issues. We can also see the rise of totalitarianism. And I guess when we see the invasion of Russia, that's the worst expression of that. President Putin's obviously massively miscalculated on the response of the Ukrainians and also on the response of Europe. And this is the problem with totalitarian systems when one person rules. The judgments can be flawed. The other area I think we need to look at is the ecology. And in this, I'm bringing in climate change as well. So we've got a lot really severe ecological degradation in many parts of the world, and we really need to clearly address this. This is particularly in Africa, but other parts of the world as well, South Asia, Middle East would be some examples. And so we really need to focus on addressing these issues because they will lead to higher levels of conflict as we move forward into the future. I've mentioned the Sahel already, but that's got a whole series of systemic problems. Terrorism is a manifestation of those systemic problems. And I think the other area we need to think about is the global economy and looking at sort of inclusiveness and how we can look at correcting some of the growing levels of inequality in wealth, which we can see globally. And so that'd be the areas I think we need to focus on with looking at peace.
Thank you, Mr. Steve Kilele. It was a pleasure to have you today on the show. We are coming to an end in Mirada Libero, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la Red Libero.
Hola, si aún no lo has hecho, suscríbete aquí a nuestro canal de YouTube. Estarás al día de nuestros mejores programas que no encontrarás en otro lugar.